Sorry about getting started late. It's a slow drive here. And try to get to chapter 16 at least briefly tonight. Let's go and start with a quick word of prayer, and then we will jump right into it here. Let's go have a prayer, and we'll get into Mark 15. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we get to be together. We pray that we'll take a moment of peace and reflection before we begin our class, and to offer thanks to you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for its message. Thank you for its wisdom. Thank you so much for your Son, who is the centerpiece of all of your incredible work in human history. We thank you that he died. We thank you that he was buried, that he was raised up, that he ascended to be on high, to sit at your right hand, to make the earth a footstool beneath his feet, and to defeat the last enemy, which is death. And we thank you most of all that we have hope in him, that we too will be raised up on the last day, that we may have life eternal with you, with your Son, with the Spirit, in your household. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right. Now, of course, we're not going to have time to look at everything, but we do want to skim. We do want to skim these chapters and kind of pick up the highlights. And I do have a couple of slides on Mark 16, 9 through 20. That's the big question. It's like everybody just wants to get to the end of Mark so we can talk about whether or not the end of Mark really belongs in the Bible. I know that that's a kind of a controversial thing to talk about, but I think I've got an explanation for it that at least I think makes a lot of sense. So we get here to chapter 15, and early in the morning, after Jesus has been betrayed and he's brought before the chief priests, and he's there, the elders, the scribes, the entire council, they held a consultation binding Jesus. They led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, where is Pilate in all this? Let's talk a little bit about where we are here in the city of Jerusalem. I don't know if that's big enough for everybody to really tell what's going on, but this would be Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. You obviously have the Temple Mount right here, which is, that's it. That's the highest point in the city. That's the centerpiece of Jewish life in Jerusalem. You have, if you kind of look here, there's a little outline right here. The Temple Mount plus this right here was kind of the original city of David, okay? When David first defeated the Jebusites and took over Jerusalem, the city really didn't consist of more than just like a sliver on top of a hill. And over time, David added, and then Solomon added, then Hezekiah added, and the city got bigger and bigger and bigger. Then Herod the Great added a whole bunch of stuff. Herod also added a lot of amenities that would be appealing to a more Hellenistic clientele, more Hellenistic population, including the Hippodrome and theaters and other stuff like that. So Herod's palace, you see here, Herod's, I know this is the whole other side of the room over there. You're on your own. You're fine. Herod's palace, that would be the palace of Herod the Great, okay? Herod the Great is where Pilate set up shop whenever he was in town. That is actually, we're going to see the word praetorium a little bit later on in the text, and that's also the word that's used in other gospel accounts. The praetorium is also Herod's palace. Caiaphas' house was probably somewhere between the Temple Mount and Herod's palace, or the praetorium. And this other little building up here in the top corner of the Temple Mount, the Antonia Fortress, that's actually like the garrison of the Romans. So the Roman soldiers would actually be housed there in like a barracks in the fortress of Antonia. Some historians believe that Pilate might have stayed in the fortress, but based on what they know of it and its dimensions, like from archaeology, it would not have been a really suitable dwelling place for someone as eminent as the governor of that area. So it's most likely, and most historians agree, most likely that Pilate was staying in Herod's palace. That's the Praetorium, and it was a place that was worthy of his abode. This is kind of what you see. Maybe what it looks like. Don't know exactly what it looks like, but this is probably about what it looked like. Kind of two buildings with a large courtyard in between, and the whole thing was surrounded by a very large, very thick, very tall wall. All right, and there was probably a courtyard just outside, and that courtyard, if you see from over there on that right side of the picture, this courtyard, that is probably where the crowd gathered and were crying, "Crucify him, crucify him." That's probably where Pilate brought Jesus out and said, "Well, what do you want me to do with your King of the Jews, huh?" It was probably in that courtyard, because the biblical text does note that the Jews did not want to enter into the Praetorium because they didn't want to defile themselves in preparation of partaking of their meals that day. So it was probably in that outer courtyard that the Jews would have been out there kicking and screaming and crying for blood. This is in the Tower of David Museum in Jerusalem. There's a foundation wall right here, these very old stones at the bottom. Those old stones at the bottom, the really rough-looking ones, that is probably the foundation of Herod the Great's palace, also known as the Praetorium. And outside, this is outside of that wall I was talking about. This is probably kind of the area of the courtyard where Pilate would have gone out and met the Jews as they were asking for Jesus to be crucified. So that's kind of neat to just kind of go into Jerusalem a little bit and imagine ourselves in this scenery. That's another picture just kind of reoriented, and that's the big model of ancient Jerusalem that you can actually see in Jerusalem. It's a really neat model that's kind of laid out of what Jerusalem looks like, and you can walk, you see a path there in the foreground. People can walk around it and just kind of visualize what Jerusalem must have been like in the first century. So we're going to keep that there for now until we get to the end of our lesson. I've got some stuff about chapter 16. So just imagine yourself here in the scene, a chilly morning, chilly enough that people are gathered around small fires to try and warm themselves up. And here Jesus gets to meet with the governor, Pilate. All right, verse 2. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" John 18 also shows that that was of particular interest to Pilate. I think when you kind of look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together, Pilate comes across as a very pragmatic person. He's just, the consummate politician. It's all about the politics and the optics and everything like that. And he seems kind of uninterested in all the religious implications at first, until finally the Jews get to this accusation about, well, he says he's a king, and all of a sudden that kind of gets Pilate's attention. Like, wait. What was that last part you said? Rewind it. A king. So they say you're a king. Is that what you claim to be? And John 18 is that whole conversation about that. And Jesus plainly answers, "It is as you say." He questions him further. Do you make no answer? Look at the charges. But verse 5 says Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. So it's interesting that dual fulfillment here, not only, or at least dual function, not only is he fulfilling the Isaiah 53 prophecy that he would be like a lamb silent before his shearers, would not open his mouth, but he also at the same time is amazing the very man who's questioning him. Sometimes it's the stuff that we don't say that impresses people the most. It's our composure, it's our patience, it's our ability to bite our tongue and to know when just to know when to be quiet about stuff. Like, you don't always have to say everything. And Pilate I love how Mark says he's amazed. Maybe he's just amazed at the situation because the whole thing is a little bit extraordinary. I tend to think that he's amazed at Jesus for just kind of being stoic. In the face of imminent demise, Jesus just kind of holds his chin high and doesn't make any excuses. Okay, so in verses 6 through 15, we get to the thing about Barabbas. Who's Barabbas? Somebody give me the short version of Barabbas. What do we know about him? It's not much, but what do we know about Barabbas? Okay, he's a murderer, and not just any he didn't just murder someone because he looked at me funny, right? He murdered. Why? What was the circumstance surrounding this murder?
Insurrection.
Yeah, it was insurrection. Insurrection. In Luke's account, even says it was insurrection that took place in the city. So this was in Jerusalem, something this is hot in the news. This was, somebody parked the Cybertruck out in front of the Temple Mount and lit it on fire, and everybody was all up in arms over it. That's not really what happened. You get what I'm saying, right? But yeah, it was some kind of an insurrection. This was some kind of subversive political activity that got out of hand, and what maybe started as just subversive political activity, someone got killed in the process, and the guy is now being held in prison as a murderer related to political unrest. So what are Barabbas' prospects right now? Not only are you a murderer, but it's a murder with political implications to Rome. What do you think your prospects are? Not good. Not good. So when they rouse him awake early it's 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and hey, Barabbas, get up, you dirty dog. We're setting you free. He probably thought he was going to get crucified that day. Now I'm not saying he actually was. The text doesn't say that he was up for crucifixion that day, but maybe my imagination runs wild, and I admit it always does. But I was just thinking about maybe Barabbas thought he was going to get crucified that day. That cross that's sitting out in the courtyard over there that they're prepping that day, they're kind of sharpening the nails with a file, getting them ready. Maybe he's thinking well, that's it. I'm a murderer and an insurrectionist. What else are they going to do before the day of preparation? Maybe he thought he was going to get crucified that day, and it turns out he was set free. Why does Pilate set him free? I get he sets him free because the Jews asked for it, but what's the tradition? Why is this whole thing even being discussed? What was Pilate's custom with them?
Set somebody free.
Yeah, as a peace gesture, an offering, an olive branch of some kind, every year at the festival. There's some merit to it, though. The Bible doesn't say this was his motive, but I think there's something to it. Does Pilate believe that Jesus is guilty of any crimes? No. And clearly, John's account in particular highlights the fact that Pilate's man, I've examined him. He's definitely not done anything worthy of death. Maybe he's a troublemaker. I don't know. But he definitely doesn't deserve to die. And he tries to get Jesus released. Do you think there's something to the theory that maybe of all the people in the prison, that Pilate handpicks a murderer and says, okay, your choices are I'll release Jesus, who's a religious troublemaker, at worst, or a murderer. And who do they pick? Give us the murderer. Release a convicted murderer onto the streets. We would rather have a murderer wandering the streets of Jerusalem than Jesus wandering the streets of Jerusalem. It's fascinating, isn't it? The choices that they make, this crowd. We say the Jews, and you understand I don't mean the entire ethnicity of Jews, but I mean this crowd of Jews in Jerusalem under these circumstances. It's interesting that, back in John's Gospel in chapter 19, when he talks about, well, what do you want me to do with your king? And they say, we don't have a king but Caesar. Do they make their choice? They make their choice. We don't want Jesus. We'd rather have Caesar as our king. Well, given the choice between Barabbas, the murderer, or Jesus, who do you pick? We pick Barabbas, the murderer. It's what does that tell you when you would rather have a maniacal dictator who thinks he's a living God as your king, and you would rather have a convicted murderer roaming your neighborhood. You would rather have that than Jesus. It's pretty striking, isn't it? All right, anything else to verse 15 before we move on?
I was just going to say, neither of them were a threat to what they were standing for, what they wanted, what they.
Yeah.
The murderer wasn't a threat to them per se, and the king wasn't a threat. It didn't change their livelihood in any way.
Yeah.
By getting rid of him, then they could continue on being the head people in charge and all of these things, versus not getting rid of him, where then he's taking your power away from you.
Here's the irony. That's a good comment, Stacy. The irony is that if you actually look at Barabbas and Caesar, right, these very clear choices, you have Jesus or Barabbas, you can have Jesus or Caesar. They pick Barabbas and Caesar. It's ironic that they view Jesus as the greater threat, when in reality it's people like Barabbas and Caesar that are the real threats. They're worried about upsetting the Romans, right? That's the chief priest. The chief priest, Caiaphas, is all upset. Annas, I think, and the chief priest is all upset about this because he's like, Jesus is upsetting the Romans. If the Romans come, they'll take our kingdom away. We're going to get in big trouble with the Romans. We got to figure out how to deal with this. Well, it's guys like Barabbas that are making that hard. Insurrectionists? It actually doesn't serve the purpose of the chief priest, who is a collaborator with the Romans. It does not serve the purposes of the chief priest to have guys like Barabbas running around, because they're just causing trouble. They're murdering, they're stabbing people, they're lighting fires, they're causing trouble for them. Like, dude, do you want the Romans to come and kill all of us? Then simmer down. So it's Barabbas actually represents a real and now convicted and actual problem for the chief priest in maintaining the peace that they need for Rome to not come down hard on them and take their kingdom away. And then, of course, Caesar himself represents everything that they hate, which is subjugation to Rome. So it's like, these are actual identifiable threats to the Jews in Judea, living under the Roman Empire. But you'd rather have Jesus because you view him as the bigger threat. That is so upside down. That makes sense? I hope I explained that properly. Like, that is so ridiculous. It's so upside down. All right, so we keep going here, and beginning in verse 16, the soldiers take him into the palace, that is the Praetorium. So even Mark identifies Herod's palace with the Praetorium. So if it's not, convincing enough, this is where they are. So, again, the crowd is out here in this courtyard. Pilate comes out of his palace, and he's standing in this archway, kind of presenting himself, going, okay, well, what do you want me to do with him? And this crowd says, crucify him. So he brings Jesus back into the Praetorium and roughs him up, beats him up, puts a crown of thorns on his head. The Roman soldiers are making fun of him. They put a scarlet robe on him. And if your translation says purple or scarlet, they're in Roman fashion, in Roman clothing, crimson, scarlet, purple are all essentially the same color, all right, in Roman fashion. So whatever your translation says, purple robe, crimson robe, scarlet robe, all the same thing. And they make fun of him. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews," in verse 18. They beat him with a stick. They spit on him. They were kneeling down and bowing before him, of course, in verse 19, in an insulting and demeaning manner. When they were all done mocking him, they took the robe off, put his garments back on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Verse 21, we meet an interesting fellow now. Who do we meet in verse 21? Who's there? Who do we meet? Simon of Cyrene. Okay, Simon of Cyrene. We don't know a lot about him, although in typical Markian fashion, I like to point out the little Mark details that nobody else does. Everybody else talks about Simon of Cyrene, but only Mark as he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Just in case you wanted to know, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Thanks, Mark. So, yeah, he includes that little detail there in verse 21. Cyrene is a city in North Africa. I believe it would be in like modern day Libya. Okay, so clearly this is a man he's in all likelihood a Jew from modern day Libya, Cyrene, and he's there for the festival, and he's just kind of minding his own business. He's just like a guy. He's just a guy. He's just there. He's a dad in Washington, D.C., taking pictures in front of he's doing this with the Washington Monument. Look at this. Take the picture, sweetie. That he's just there. He's just a guy. And he gets pressed into service doing what? What do the Roman soldiers make him do? Help Jesus carry the cross. Now, in Roman law, the Roman soldiers were allowed to do this. Anybody they wanted, they could ask any Jew and say, you probably saw this if you watched The Chosen, the most recent season, where Jesus and his disciples actually strap on backpacks and armor and everything and carry the stuff for a bunch of Roman soldiers and then go an extra mile. It's a really, really neat moment, actually. But Roman soldiers were allowed to just go right up to Wayne and say, Wayne, carry my bag for me. A mile. Come on. So this was very normal, very common for them. You ever wonder, I'd like to meet Simon of Cyrene. I certainly hope that guy became a Christian. What a story that would have been, right? What a story to share with your children and grandchildren and other Christians, other believers, to be like, I was there. I was right next to him. I mean, Jesus, we were right there holding the cross together, and when I was done, sweat and blood, this whole side of my body, I got the sweat and the blood of Jesus on my whole side of my clothes. Like, what a memory that would have been. And we don't really know anything else about it. It's like, just kind of shows up and that's it. So they go to a place, and it's called Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. Maybe I have, there we go. Supposedly, Golgotha might have been somewhere around here, outside the city, definitely outside the city. We don't really know exactly where Golgotha is. If you go to modern-day Jerusalem, there's a really interesting, knoll, a little hill that sticks out, and it's kind of looks like a skull. It's got two indents where there's eyes and sort of shaped like a skull. Some people think that maybe that's Golgotha because it looks like a skull. A lot of people aren't really sure about that. You can even tell the word Golgotha has a big question mark next to it. We don't really know. It's definitely outside of the city. We don't really know where it is. And I think most archaeologists today do not think that the skull-shaped rock is actually where Golgotha was. But it's kind of interesting to think about. Why do you think they called it Golgotha? What does that word mean? Yeah, place of a skull. Why does that seem like a fitting name for this place? For executing people. Yeah, to me, it doesn't need to be shaped like a skull to make sense. This is a place where we drag people out of the prison, take them up to the top of the hill where everybody in the city can see it. Very prominent place up on top of a hill. We're going to crucify people. That's the place of the skull. That's the place of death. It's an execution place. Yeah, very morbid, very dark. Okay, they crucified him. They divided up his garments. John notes in his account that this was to fulfill prophecy. And Psalm 22, of course, is where that prophecy comes from. Very clearly in Psalm 22, they divided my garments amongst them, and for my clothes they cast lots. So that's a prophecy that comes true. They crucified him. The inscription above it in 3 different languages was the King of the Jews. They also crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right, one on his left. And, verse 29 mentions that even, that's the passers-by. We don't know a lot about the 2 robbers from Mark's account, but we do learn from other accounts, though, that one of the robbers, before his life was over, did end up confessing his belief in Jesus and asking that he would be with Jesus. And what was Jesus' promise to him? That this day you'll be with me in paradise. But at least at first, we know that the 2 robbers were together insulting Jesus and mocking him. It was amazing that at least for one of them, a couple hours dying on a cross under the hot Middle Eastern sun will sober you up real fast. Right? Sober you up real fast. All right, they were insulting him, verse 29, wagging their heads. Psalm 22, I believe, even mentions that. Psalm 22 talks about how they were casting insults at me. Verse 33, darkness fell over the whole land about the 6th hour, and it was dark until the 9th hour. We understand that they count their hours differently than we do today. They don't use a 24-hour clock like we use. They count their hours from sunrise and onward. So if sunrise is roughly 6 o'clock in the morning, then what would that make the 6th hour of the day? About noon. 9th hour would be about 3 o'clock, right? All right. All right, I want to focus. Let's slow down a little bit here because I want to talk about this little story about Elijah, all right? Can somebody read for me, please, verses 35 through 38? 35 through 38. Somebody get that for me.
Some of those who stood by, when they heard that, they said, "Look, he's calling for Elijah." Then someone ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink, saying, "Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
All right, I am legitimately curious about your explanation for this because I have been pondering this for, as long as I could read the Bible, I've been pondering what is really the meaning of this. I think maybe I've got some answers, but I am truly, truly curious what you think. When he cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting Psalm 22, it's like they immediately, for some reason, are like, wow, he's crying out for Elijah. And then someone suggests, well, why don't we get him some sour wine? And then they sit back and go, okay, well, let's see what happens now and see if Elijah comes and rescues him. Somebody help make sense out of this. What is going on here? What is the point of this really strange little anecdote from the crucifixion scene?
It's just more ways to mock him.
Okay, so Cecilia is suggesting that it's out of mockery, not curiosity, not bated breath, but they're kind of leaning back on it would take Elijah to come and rescue a guy like this. Let's see if Elijah, he left on a fiery chariot. Let's see if Elijah will come back down in his fiery chariot and rescue this guy. Maybe one explanation is, in mockery, they're essentially saying, this guy's as good as dead. Look at this. Look at him. He's barely breathing. He's got blood all dripping down everywhere. He's thirsty. He's so close to dying that his only hope of rescue is Elijah the prophet appearing in the sky on a fiery chariot to come and rescue him. Which is, what are the chances of that happening? Very close to zero. Very close. So, I think that's one way of looking at it. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation that they're mocking him.
Brian, it's funny, the feeling I had about this verse when I was a kid is slightly confirmed by the commentary of my Bible, but just saying Eloi, Eloi in Aramaic sounds like the Hebrew, like he's saying. Elijah just sounds like Elijah.
Yeah.
Even though he's quoting Psalm 22, when they heard it, it sounds like, even though he's probably speaking Aramaic, it sounds like in Hebrew, the name of Elijah. So it just sounds like he's saying the word Elijah.
So let's just say your mouth is really dry. And I mean the driest it's ever been. Waking up in the morning after having hamburgers for dinner the night before, dry. An hour after eating Arby's roast beef sandwiches, dry.
Or dry blood in your mouth.
Or even more unpleasant, because I don't know why you want to go there, Cecilia. but think about his mouth, and it's true. His mouth is blood has coagulated in his mouth. It is dry. Psalm 22 says, "My tongue cleaves to my jaws." Okay, my mouth is like a potsherd. What's a potsherd? What is that? It's a little broken piece of clay pottery. When you think of a potsherd, you think of dry. Like dry as a bone. Like a piece of potsherd in an archaeological site in the middle of the desert in the Middle East. How dry is that? As dry can get. So here's Jesus. His mouth is so dry that maybe, even as he's uttering words, his mouth is so dry that he cannot articulate the words enough, that they're just hearing him kind of muttering. He can barely breathe. His mouth is dry. He's exhausted, and maybe just in that, I don't want to replicate it because I don't speak Aramaic, but just in that moment, you can imagine like you're just not functioning, and he's just crying out, and all they're hearing like, what is it? What is he? I can't understand a word this guy's saying. It sounded like Elijah. Kind of sounded like he's crying out for Elijah.
It was a loud voice too, which means he had to like get his strength together.
Yeah, he really had to. It took work to say this, and it's entirely possible that just given the condition of his body, that he's just muttering, like he can't even speak clearly, and he can't articulate. And so with that lack of enunciation, they're not hearing what he's saying. So they think, well, let's just see whether Elijah comes to take him down. And in their politeness, I suppose, they fill a sponge with sour wine and put it on the end of a stick and shove it into his face.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah.
So the wine thing that they used to do in the myrrh, in the mouth, was
Yeah.
actually more of a torture type thing, right? It sedated them a little bit, or took away the pain, you should say, a little bit, just like to make them prolonged suffering.
Yeah.
So if you really think about it, here he is, can't talk, messed up, beaten up, on the cross, at his wit's end, and they just say, let's prolong this out a little bit more and just make him look terrible.
Yeah, what they thought was that when you mix the myrrh with sour wine, that it would kind of dull your senses a little bit and kind of like sedate you a little bit. Yeah. So they're kind of like sticking, this vinegar and a sponge on a stick and shoving it into space, trying to kind of like knock him out a little bit. Well, let's sit back and let's watch more. Let's see how long this takes. Let's prolong this a little bit. Let's see if Elijah comes and rescues him. It's very mocking.
To me, it also kind of finishes up the mockery of a king with thorns,
Yeah.
the robe, all that stuff, and then it kind of finishes off with, one.
Yeah. Hey, that is true. I think it's a good point, Clay. That it's like all the accoutrements that you think of with a king, the crown, the robe, the sign of declaration, the procession, right? I mean, he's part of a procession heading out the city, and all the people of the city are essentially filing past him. And rather than giving honor and obeisance to this king, they're spitting on him and mocking him. And to finish it all off, let's go ahead and end the day with a drink. Here's a glass of wine for you, king, or a sponge full of vinegar.
I was gonna say, a lot of times the sponges were used for like, it may have been a sponge, so it's kind of like used for the bathroom, I think. So I've heard that before.
Yeah, I don't know that, but that's
They
possible.
were used for, I think, to make it worse.
It's not like, it doesn't sound like something they planned to do. It sounds like something that was just there. So it's like maybe part of someone's toiletry kit. Maybe the soldiers have their rucksack handy, and maybe it's just part of the toiletry kit of the soldiers that they might have brought with them wherever they went. That's possible.
Okay, before you jump, I think this is what's important about Jesus being quiet in front of Pilate. So remember, he was already in the garden, prayed to his Father 3 times, let this cup pass from me to be your will. Obviously, that wasn't going to be his will. Here he is standing in front of Pilate. He has nothing to say. You know what? There's nothing to say. He knows what he's about to go through.
He's accepted it.
Yeah, and so he's accepted this, and now we're seeing this play out, what he already knows is coming, which makes that whole quiet scene even more impactful.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't have been quiet, right?
We know that.
Yeah, right. You neither.
Yeah.
So think about that. He's sitting there quiet, not even defending himself, because he knows he's about to go through this. That is, man.
Yeah. And it finally comes to an end. He uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And I just don't even know. I can't imagine it. Like, I don't think an actor in the world could properly replicate whatever that sound must have been. It was a loud cry and a final breath. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Veil, and it was not. We're not talking about like just some some drapes or just kind of some sheer fabric. The veil in the temple was supposedly like as thick as like a woven rug, so that it tore from top to bottom is not an accident. That's not a human didn't do that. The weather didn't do it. Like, well, it was getting a little moth-eaten anyway, so I'm not surprised it tore. Like, that's not. This was an Oriental rug essentially that was torn from top to bottom, as if I say this seriously, God Himself was reaching down from heaven to tear it, starting from the top, and to open up the way of the Holy of Holies to all people. And that's really what was represented by that, is the way to God through the holy place and the veil and into the most holy place. The way of God, or the way to God, was now being torn open for all people.
I think also the imagery of it being torn can be similar to what, like, when you read people in the Bible going through grief, they tear their clothes.
Yeah.
Usually from the neck open, it's how it rips open from the top down. It's kind of a similar thing. I've heard people say that about this. That's kind of with God's way of showing His grief a little bit.
Yeah.
Possibly for written.
That's a good way of looking at it too. Let me give you one thing, one bookend here. The Mark essentially starts and then closes, and I don't mean literally closes, but coming close to the end here with this idea of tearing. Back in chapter 1 and verse 10, when Jesus was baptized and God's voice came from heaven and the Holy Spirit descended, in verse 10 of chapter 1, and immediately coming up out of the water, He saw the heavens opening. That comes from a Greek word called schizophrenia. What does schizophrenia mean? Torn person, right? Two personalities, a person torn in half. Okay, or schism. What's a schism? What do we say? It's when things are ripped apart, right? Torn in half. And so that word, when it says the heavens were opening, really it means the heavens were ripped open. So it's interesting that Mark's gospel essentially opens with this scene where God rips the heavens open. He tears the heavens open and declares this is the Son of God. And now the book is nearing its conclusion now with another. The veil is being torn and ripped by God. So I think it's just kind of cool to see that as a bookend. All right, I wanted to save a few minutes for chapter 16. We could talk about Joseph of Arimathea, incredible, incredible man. He was a very quiet disciple, but a prominent member of the council. Verse 16. Jesus appears before the women witnesses, which is a really important point to make, because in this time, both in Jewish law and in Roman law, were women allowed to be witnesses in a court of law? No. So if you were fabricating the story of the resurrection, like if you were the disciples huddled together and you go, okay, Jesus is dead, but we got to keep this Jesus thing going. What are we going to do? I say we make up a story about Him coming back to life. Great! Let's find some reliable male witnesses who will be, who will really verify this story. But instead of it being men, who does Jesus choose to show Himself to first? Women. Women. If you were going to make up the story of the resurrection, that's a really dumb move, And I want to be clear. I'm not saying that it was actually dumb. I'm saying that if this was a fabricated story and Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, and you really wanted to provide some verifiable information, you would say, yeah, Jesus was raised from the dead, and that guy was there, and that man was there, and that man was there, and I was there, and Brent was there, and Scott was there. And you would not say He first appeared to a bunch of women whose word was not even considered valid in a court of law. It actually adds credibility to the resurrection account. All right, so as we get to chapter 16, there's some question, because I know all of your Bibles will have a little note at the bottom that says most of the older manuscripts do not contain verses 9 through 20. So the question comes up, are we saying that part of the Bible is not supposed to be in the Bible? Oh, does it call into question all the rest of the Bible? Were people adding stuff or taking away from the Bible? Okay, let's be clear about the Greek evidence. If I go too fast, it's just because I have 2 minutes. I've got to stuff it all in and answer the question without taking any comments or having any pushback from any of you. Okay? Two of the earliest Greek manuscripts, called Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, and I'm a big fan of Codex Sinaiticus, by the way. Love Codex Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus. You can actually go online and you can look at photographs of every single page of Codex Sinaiticus. CodexSinaiticus.org. I love Codex Sinaiticus. But they're from middle of the 4th century, so 350-ish AD. They are the two oldest, essentially complete Greek New Testaments in existence. Okay? So the fact that the two oldest, essentially complete Greek manuscripts do not contain 9 through 20 is pretty difficult to contend with, okay? And it suggests, perhaps, that these were verses that were added later by someone else. But I will say, as pushback, there is another very early manuscript about a century later called Codex Alexandrinus that does contain these verses. In addition, early Christian writers refer to this section of Mark in their own words. Irenaeus, who directly quotes chapter 16, verse 19, writes in about the 2nd century AD, Hippolytus and Dionysius in the 3rd century, and Jerome in the 4th century. Also, these verses are all included in different language versions of the New Testament that predate Codex Sinaiticus. So, earlier than Codex Sinaiticus, you have a Syriac translation of the Bible that includes these verses. You have a Sahidic, you have an Italian or a Latin, and you have a Coptic translation of the New Testament that does include all of these verses, and those are all older witnesses than Codex Sinaiticus. In addition, everything contained in these verses is verifiable and spoken in other Gospels. Every single thing you see here in these passages, you go, okay, well, that part is in Matthew, that part is in Luke, that part is in John, that's mentioned in the book of Acts. So it's like, there's nothing in these that's not in agreement. And I will say that it is possible that another author, based on eyewitness testimony, who is not Mark, right? Maybe a non-Mark author did write this and include this. But I guess my contention would be, if something is verifiable, factual history, does it matter that it is history written by someone other than Mark and then included as an appendix to Mark's gospel? If something is verifiable historical fact, it's verifiable historical fact no matter who wrote it. So I guess for me, that is all enough compelling evidence to lead me to say that I think verses 9 through 20 ought to be included in the text and regarded as Holy Scripture. Boom. There you go.
You need closure too, like it doesn't make sense to stop there.
It ends in a really abrupt way without it. It just really ends on a cliffhanger. Like like the end of a Star Trek The Next Generation season-ending episode, you go, what? I gotta wait all summer now? Yeah. It doesn't mention that it has the, yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think I'm going to record it and send it to you. I'm going to put you on that. Hey, right.
That was a lot in 2 minutes.
I did basically chapter 15 through 16. Oh, it's just that bit. Boom! Gotta put it all in there. See, that's probably the part of the class that you were most excited to hear about.
I know that.
Jonathan loves the historical side. Archaeology, history, yeah, that's kind of his wheelhouse.
Today I was on the news and they were like, melting glaciers in this way are showing prehistoric. I was like, let's take a start reading all this. I love all that. I've never ever heard of it. I think for 2 weeks it's all talked about.
He's telling his friends at work.
Our band kids.
You doing okay? Right, it sounds good. Let's plan on it. Come by after work. Sounds like a plan.
3 hours, catch black hunter, and they'll eat it, that's all it is, for 3 hours. For 3 hours.
And an earthquake,
But, and earthquake, yeah. And then all of a sudden,
and people coming out
yeah,
of
the
the
people coming out of
tomb,
the tombs, yeah.
where they've been buried,
Dead people.
dead
getting
people
up.
coming out of the tomb. It's in there.
Yeah, it's gonna blow your
It's a
mind.
different account.
Yeah, different, one of those is different, yeah, one of the other ones, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, it's crazy, right? But you gotta remember, this is all a spiritual, all this stuff, because the Son of God just died. And God let that happen because.
And then it was, I've seen historical facts about the eclipse. I didn't know about earthquakes.
Yeah, so here's the problem. He let all that happen so that everybody knew, oh, this was the Son of God. Because otherwise, he just would have died and what?
That's exactly what the guy said, truly, this was the Son of